Who was Thales? Thales of Miletus, born circa 624 BC in Miletus, Asia Minor, now Turkey, to circa 547 BC, was the son of Exames and Cleobuline. His parents are said by some to be from Miletus, but others report that they were Phoenicians. Thales seems to be the first known Greek philosopher, mathematician, and scientist, although his primary job was that of an engineer. He is believed to have been the teacher of Anaximander, 611 BC to 545 BC. Early sources report that one of Anaximander's more famous pupils, Pythagoras, visited Thales as a young man, and that Thales advised him to travel to Egypt to further his philosophical and mathematical studies. Many philosophers followed Thales' lead in searching for explanations in nature rather than in the supernatural. Others returned to supernatural explanations, but couched them in the language of philosophy rather than of myth or of religion. He was the first natural philosopher in the Milesian school. However, none of his writing survives, so it is difficult to determine his views or to be certain about his mathematical discoveries. Indeed, it is unclear whether he wrote any works at all, and if he did, they were certainly lost by the time of Aristotle, who did not have access to any writings of Thales. Some claims have been made that he wrote a book on navigation, but these are based on hardly any evidence. In the book on navigation, it is suggested that he used the constellation Ursa Minor, which he defined as an important feature in his navigation techniques. Even if the book is fictitious, it is quite probable that Thales did indeed define the constellation Ursa Minor. Proclus, the last major Greek philosopher who lived around 450 AD, wrote, "Thales first went to Egypt and thence introduced the study, geometry, into Greece. He discovered many propositions himself and instructed his successors in the principles underlying many others. His method of attacking problems had greater generality in some cases and was more in the nature of simple inspection and observation in other cases." There is a difficulty in writing about Thales and others from a similar period. Although there are numerous references to Thales which would enable us to reconstruct quite a number of details, the sources must be treated with care, since it was the habit of the time to credit famous men with discoveries they did not make. Partly this was as a result of the legendary status that men like Thales achieved, and partly it was the result of scientists with relatively little history behind their subjects trying to increase the status of the topic with giving it a historical background. Certainly, Thales was a figure of enormous prestige, being the only philosopher before Socrates to be among the seven sages. Plutarch, writing of these seven sages, says that Thales was apparently the only one of these whose wisdom stepped in speculation beyond the limits of practical utility. The rest acquired the reputation of wisdom in politics. There are several accounts of how Thales measured the height of pyramids. Plutarch recounts the story in a form which, if accurate, would mean that Thales was getting close to the idea of similar triangles. Without trouble or the assistance of any instrument, he merely set up a stick at the extremity of the shadow cast by the pyramid, and having thus made two triangles by the impact of the sun's rays, showed that the pyramid has to the stick the same ratio which the shadow of the pyramid has to the shadow of the stick. Although there is much evidence to suggest that Thales made some fundamental contributions to geometry, it is easy to interpret his contributions in the light of our own knowledge, thereby believing that Thales had a fuller appreciation of geometry than he could possibly have achieved. In many textbooks on the history of mathematics, Thales is credited with 5 theorems of elementary geometry. 1. A circle is bisected by any diameter. 2. The base angles of an isosceles triangle are equal. 3. The angles between two intersecting straight lines are equal. 4. Two triangles are congruent if they have two angles and one side equal. 5. An angle in a semicircle is a right angle. Proclus had this to say about the 4th theorem. Eudemus says that the method by which Thales showed how to find the distances of ships from the shore necessarily involves the use of this theorem. As a final comment on these 5 theorems, there are conflicting stories regarding Theorem 4, as Diogenes Laertius himself is aware. Also, even Pamphile cannot be taken as an authority since she lived in the 1st century AD, long after the time of Thales. Others have attributed the story about the sacrifice of an ox to Pythagoras on discovering Pythagoras' theorem. Certainly, there is much confusion and very little certainty. He was aware of the existence of the Lodestone and was the first to be connected to knowledge of this in history. According to Aristotle, Thales thought lodestones had souls because iron is attracted to them by the force of magnetism. Thales applied his method to objects that changed to become other objects, such as water into earth, or so he thought. Thales also applied his method to the act of change itself, approaching it through lodestone and amber, which, when electrified by rubbing together, also attracts. As for the ability of a mover to move something else without being changed itself, Thales saw a commonality between that and the power of a living thing to act. The lodestone and the amber must be alive, and if that were so, there could be no difference between the living and the dead. When asked why he didn't die, if there was no difference, he replied, because there is no difference. Aristotle defined the soul as the principle of life, that which imbues the matter and makes it live, giving it the animation or power to act. The idea did not originate with him, as the Greeks in general believed in the distinction between mind and matter, which was ultimately to lead to a distinction not only between body and soul, but also between matter and energy. If things were alive, they must have souls. This belief was no innovation, as the ordinary ancient populations of the Mediterranean did believe that natural actions were caused by divinities. Accordingly, Aristotle and other ancient writers state that Thales believed that all things were full of gods. In their zeal to make him the first in everything, some said he was the first to hold the belief, which must have been widely known to be false. However, Thales was looking for something more general, a universal substance of mind. That also was in the polytheism of the times. Zeus was the very personification of supreme mind, dominating all the subordinate manifestations. From Thales on, however, philosophers had a tendency to depersonify or objectify mind as though it were the substance of animation per se, and not actually a god like the other gods. The end result was a total removal of mind from substance, opening the door to a non-divine principle of action. This led to one of his most famous quotes, which later was written on the pronaos of the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, Greece. "Know thyself, and thou shalt know the universe and the gods." Our knowledge of the philosophy of Thales is due to Aristotle, who wrote in his Metaphysics, "Thales of Miletus taught that all things are water." Thales is recognized for breaking from the use of mythology to explain the world and the universe, and instead explaining natural objects and phenomena by theories and hypotheses, i.e. science. Almost all the other pre-Socratic philosophers followed him in explaining nature as deriving from a unity of everything, based on the existence of a single ultimate substance, instead of using mythological explanations. Aristotle reported Thales' hypothesis that the originating principle of nature and the nature of matter was a single material, substance, water. Thales believed that the earth floats on water and all things come to be from water. For him, the earth was a flat disk floating on an infinite ocean. It has also been claimed that Thales explained earthquakes from the fact that the earth floats on water. Again, the importance of Thales' idea is that he is the first recorded person who tried to explain such phenomena by rational rather than by supernatural means. It is interesting that Thales has both stories told about his great practical skills and also about him being an unworldly dreamer. Aristotle, for example, relates a story of how Thales used his skills to deduce that the next season's olive crop would be a very large one. He therefore bought all the olive presses and then was able to make a fortune when the bumper olive crop did indeed arrive. Aristotle explains that Thales' objective in doing this was not to enrich himself, but to prove to his fellow Milesians that philosophy could be useful. Contrary to what they thought, or, alternatively, Thales had made his foray into enterprise because of a personal challenge put to him by an individual who had asked why, if Thales was an intelligent, famous philosopher, he had yet to attain wealth. Thales was a hylozoist, one who thinks that matter is alive, i.e. containing souls. Aristotle wrote of Thales in De Anima, Thales thought all things are full of gods. Aristotle posits the origin of Thales' thought on matter generally containing souls. To Thales' thinking initially on the fact of, because magnets move iron, the presence of movement of matter indicated this matter contained life. The most natural epithets of Thales are materialist and naturalist, which are based on ousia and physis. The Catholic Encyclopedia notes that Aristotle called him a physiologist with the meaning student of nature. On the other hand, he would have qualified as an early physicist, as did Aristotle. They studied corpora, bodies, the medieval descendants of substances. Due to his magnificent study of nature itself, it is probably no surprise at all that we find out that Thales predicted the solar eclipse of May 28, 585 BC, also known as the Eclipse of Thales. According to Herodotus, the appearance of the eclipse was interpreted as an omen, and interrupted a battle in a long-standing war between the Medes and the Lydians. The fighting immediately stopped, and they agreed to a truce. Plato tells the story of how, one night, Thales was gazing at the sky as he walked and fell into a ditch. A pretty servant girl lifted him out and said to him, "How do you expect to understand what is going on up in the sky if you do not even see what is at your feet?" Diogenes Laertius quotes the chronicle of Apollodorus of Athens as saying that Thales died at the age of 78 during the 58th Olympiad, 548 to 545 BC, and attributes his death to heat stroke while watching the games.